Well, welcome back. We will, from this point on, be talking about Daniel chapters 1 through 6 and the short stories. But just as a transition point, we can see something consistent between the stories of Esther and Daniel. And like I said, this is consistent with other stories that we can see in the courts of foreign kings, where God seems somewhat, perhaps oddly distant, removed. God seems to be a God of providence, a God who structures long terms of history rather than jumping down and being involved in the minutiae or the small details of life. In the story of Joseph, we said that this occurred also in Nehemiah, where God isn't a central character, even if Nehemiah does pray, but there's these kind of small hints that God is at work in the world. So this hidden God we can also see in Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Daniel chapter 7 is part of a big shift. So I'll try to explain that shift now, but we're going to focus on Daniel chapters 7 through 12, which have a very different portrait of God and consist of a different genre and probably a different sociological setting. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But we're going to focus this time on the diasporic stories, the court stories of Daniel chapters 1 through 6, which share some features with Esther. It doesn't have as kind of coherent a narrative overall. As you see Daniel chapters 1 through 6, if you just read through them, you'll see that they're episodic. They tend to focus on kind of one story at a time. Daniel chapters 1 through 4 do form a somewhat coherent narrative about Nebuchadnezzar and end up being about kind of the reform or transformation of Nebuchadnezzar. But then chapter 5 changes that story, and then chapter 6 is different altogether too. You'll also notice that Daniel's friends appear and disappear outside of chapter 1, apart from Daniel. Daniel in chapter 3 doesn't really mention Daniel, and Daniel chapter 6 doesn't mention the friends. So we might have some different stories here from different points in time that have been combined together into one narrative cycle that incorporates all of these characters, with Daniel chapter 1 really tying that all together. And the book of Daniel has been important throughout Christian history and Jewish history as a witness, really, of how people can survive in difficult situations. This is an early Christian catacomb painting, one of the earliest paintings that we have, images that we have of Daniel, and Daniel's between the lions here. He's naked in this picture, not in the book of Daniel, but he's naked here because he's a symbol for baptism and the death but new life that comes through baptism. The lion's den was seen as a foreshadowing of Christ being in the tomb. And you can see it says Daniel up above him, painted up there in the upper corner. So thinking of how early Christians understood Daniel as a text that helped people prepare for and deal with life and death, but also living in the midst of a foreign empire, which of course Christians were in the early Roman Empire. So this book of Daniel, as I said, is in two parts, chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 12. Biblical scholars assume that these two different parts of the book relate to two different historical settings. So chapters 1 through 6 mention the Babylonian Empire. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is a Babylonian king, and then there's a Persian king mentioned. It's actually king of the Medes, Darius, which doesn't make sense because there was no king of the Medes named Darius. Darius was a king of the Persians. So we have some sort of historical issue there. And there's lots of different ways that people deal with this, but still, to say it goes into the Persian period. And then part of the book refers to Susa and parts of the Persian Empire. And then there's a mention in chapter 2 of what seems to be very clearly the Greek kingdoms. Chapter 2 seems to be share a lot in common with chapters 7 through 12. There's the four kingdom kind of progression that both chapter 7 and chapter 2 share. I'm going to cover more of that when we get to chapter 7 as a way of like reinterpreting chapter 2 as a springboard to get to chapter 7 and chapter 7 through 12, because chapter 7 through 12 seem to reflect this different historical situation. They seem to come from the land of Judah, as opposed to this diasporic setting within the Persian Empire or the Babylonian Empire. They also reflect a very specific historical problem, a crisis moment, with a Greek king named Antiochus IV. So he reigned. He was king over the area around Judah from 167 to 164. There was a crisis during those moments, so we'll talk about that crisis next time. But just to say that there's these two different kind of moments. So we're going to focus on chapters 1 through 6 and the court stories and the diasporic setting that we imagine came along with those court stories. So this is, again, like Esther, Jews that are living far away, not in exile anymore. The exile's over, right? So Daniel continues to live in the foreign land after the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, well into the Persian era. So he's in diaspora, not exile anymore. even though Daniel begins by trying to give an explanation for the exile, which I'll get to in a minute. Let me move my talking head here for a moment just to show this little part of this graph. You can see that Daniel actually is a strange book in that it shares two languages. It starts out, chapters 1 through 2, verse 4, actually A, like the first half of verse 4, those are all in Hebrew. And it's in bad Hebrew, like really bad Hebrew, like so bad that someone didn't speak this language they were trying to write in it. Like if you ask me to write an essay in Spanish, I can speak a little bit of Spanish. I can't write well in it, right? Or ask me to write in German. I can speak and read a little bit of German, but if I try to write an essay in German, it's going to come out sounding like child German and bad child German, right? Not like morally bad, right? Just not proper German. But this is like that. Daniel chapters 1 through 2, 4a, 2 verse 4, first half of the verse 4, and then it resumes in chapters 8 through 12 are all in Hebrew as well, and again in this bad Hebrew, like Hebrew that was written by someone who didn't speak Hebrew anymore and was trying to reclaim it as a language. It appears. Chapter 2 verse 4. B, the second half of verse 4, through chapter 7, all the way to the end of chapter 7, that's all in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the empire. It was the language that the Persians requested and demanded that all of the peoples of the Levant used to coordinate and cooperate with the Persian Empire. So it was a learned language. It was kind of like Hebrew, very close, but not the same language. And so the people, the scribes who lived in Judah, had to learn this new language and then use it to communicate within the Persian Empire. It was a way for the Persians to kind of distance themselves from the other people, so they didn't make people learn Persian, right? They didn't want their language to get out and get used by all these crazy people, right? What they wanted was for all these people to learn a shared common language. So they picked the language of Syria or Aram, and used that. This is also where the Aramaic square script comes from. Before this, they used that much earlier called Proto-Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew, this kind of earlier form of script than what we learn in. So what we've all learned here at CTS is the Aramaic square script, which is just the letters that the Aramaic writers used. They kind of just stole the alphabet. So it was easier to write with. But in any event, all to say that this language of empire is something that all the scribes had to use, and eventually most people just kind of ended up speaking it. This is what we see in Ezra and in Nehemiah. There's this concern over language. Remember, Nehemiah gets real mad and starts like yelling at parents for letting their kids speak some other language, probably Aramaic or something like it. And when we see in the New Testament that Jesus speaks, he speaks in sort of Aramaic. Everyone says he speaks in Aramaic, but he doesn't. So Talitha Kum, that's little girl get up. The Gospels record that Jesus speaks this in Aramaic, but Talitha is right for Aramaic for little girl. Kum is not. Kum's Hebrew. So little girl in Aramaic, get up in Hebrew is what Jesus says. And then on the cross, Jesus says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is a quote from Psalm 22, verse 1. And it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Eloi, Eloi is good Hebrew. That's how you say my God in Hebrew. And lama is why or how in Hebrew. And then sabachthani is only in Aramaic. You can't say that in Hebrew. It doesn't make any sense in Hebrew. So it's a combination. What Jesus says from the cross is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. So all to say that the language of Daniel, it kind of shares this. The part that's in Aramaic is in this kind of Judahite Aramaic. I don't know, Aramaish, whatever you want to call it. But it is striking that this one book is written in these two very different languages, and that those languages don't actually correspond to the different genres. Right, so chapters 7 through 12 are the apocalyptic stuff. Chapters 1 through 6 are the court stories, but chapters 2 through 7 are the Aramaic stuff. All to say that this book has a very complex history of composition and redaction being passed down. There's actually different versions of the book of Daniel that are quite different from one another that early Christians and early Jews used. What we use, Protestant Christians today in our Bibles, we use the Jewish version actually. The early Christian version was taken from an also earlier Jewish version that developed at the same time as the version that we use right now, like right next to each other. They have very different versions of like chapters 4 through 6 especially. So like the story of the handwriting on the wall, it's very different in the version that early Christians used. So all to say, like, this is a complex book that betrays, or that's not. It sounds like I'm saying a bad thing when I say betrays, but just like demonstrates a very complex history of production. and probably reflects what the languages meant. So why would you write in Aramaic? Well, it's the language of the empire, but it's also maybe what you're just using. So Aramaic became normal at that time, and people weren't even thinking it was bad to use it. And then why would you write the rest of the book in terrible Hebrew? Maybe because Aramaic begins to be like the language of the empire, and you start to realize that, and then you try to reclaim Hebrew. This happens sometime around the year 167 BC with that bad Greek king who tries to persecute the Jewish people, and they reclaim Hebrew. So all to say that chapters 1 and then chapters 8 through 12 do seem to probably come from a later time when people are trying to reclaim their local national language that has been lost to history somewhat, in order to kind of proclaim their own resistance against the empire. We'll get to more of this on the last module for this class when we talk about apocalyptic literature. But chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel are a little bit more about like how to get along in the midst of an empire that has spaces for you but doesn't really care about you. Chapters 7 through 12 are what happens when the empire, you can't get along with the empire anymore. When the empire tries to exterminate you, what's God going to do then? What are the options left? And that's apocalyptic. So, all to say, that's kind of our background. So this is an Ethiopian manuscript that I love that has a picture of Daniel in the lion's den, but I love that Daniel's kind of like, I got to sit through this stuff, okay. But in any event, if we start with chapter 1, chapter 1 is a fascinating story. I'm going to walk us through a little bit of it right now. But just to say, these stories are always more complex than we give them credit for. Carol Newsom, wonderful biblical interpreter, and my Dr. Mutter at Emory University, she has a great reading of this story, and I'm going to walk us through that in just a little bit. I'm going to start with this, though, in just chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So here's the beginning of the exile, right? The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar, which is a name for Mesopotamia that's only used a couple times in the Bible, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Okay, so the Lord let, right? And this is, the Lord gave King Jehoiakim of Judah, allowed King Jehoiakim to fall into the power of. So this is a different way, really different theology of the exile than we're used to getting in, say, the prophets. So Jeremiah, remember, says you deserved it. You earned it in a way. Deuteromistic history says this is something that we did to ourselves over the span of many many decades, and even centuries, and that we've built up sin upon sin, and we haven't listened to God's call for us to change. And ultimately, it's the leaders that were in charge of that and responsible for it, and they refused to do anything to change. So Jeremiah says, well, then there's one thing that God can do, that's unbuild the system, give some fallow space, and then try to rebuild the system again. That's one way of thinking about the reason that the exile happened. But Daniel has an alternative theology of the exile. Why did it happen? The Lord let this happen. And the rest of the book, I think, at least chapters 1 through 6, are an implicit explanation for why that is. Daniel and his friends are taken away into the courts of these foreign kings, and they witness. They witness to the God of Israel, and they tell eventually Nebuchadnezzar about this God and about this God's power. And Nebuchadnezzar, according to the story, now there's no historical kind of documentation about this, but according to Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar eventually understands that Yahweh is the God of the universe. I mean, this is, it's a way, it's a way of expanding God's witness. That's this theology of the exile. It's not trying to, I think, cover over the pain of the exile or the difficulties of the exile. It's trying to give, I think, a mission to the Judahites who have been spread abroad in the land. Having a mission like this, some sort of sense of who we are, what we're supposed to be doing, why would this have happened, that is positive, that gives them a sense of that they're part of the destiny of God's plan for the entire world, fits both with that kind of post-exilic theology that is the hidden God, right? That God has kind of planned out this long moral arc in history, and us being pushed out of our land actually ends up bringing us closer to fulfilling something like what Isaiah chapter 2 says, which is that all the nations of the earth will one day stream to Jerusalem and seek God's Torah there, right? Seek the presence of the Lord and the teachings of the Lord. That's what Nebuchadnezzar does. So really, like, how how do we bear our witness in a place that is hostile to us? That I think is what Daniel chapters 1-6 is trying to encourage people to do. But how do you do it intelligently, and how do you do it without risking your own life? A lot of people think that Daniel 1-6 is all about being martyrs. I don't think so. I don't think that they want to die, right? They're not trying to risk their own lives. Daniel in chapter 6 doesn't go out and pray outdoors like so that everyone can see him. He's actually just praying in his house, right? At the time of day he normally does. So he won't interrupt his own communication with God to please other people, but he's also not trying to stick his neck out. So Daniel, I think, is the book of Daniel is really trying to help people, especially 1-6, chapters 1-6, is trying to help people figure out how to live in empire and get along in empire without getting killed, but how to retain who you are. So remember I said about distinctions. Drawing distinctions is important. And in Daniel chapter 1, we see this beginning of a kind of a drawing a distinction. And for Daniel, it's about food. So chapter 1, verse 3, the king commanded Ashpenaz, the palace minister, the palace master, the sort of chief eunuch, the Rabsaris, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome. This again has to do with notions of like holiness, right? Like in Leviticus, you're supposed to bring certain kinds of animals that are tam, blameless. Again, this is ableist and all kinds of other terrible things, but it's part of the kind of theology of, more broadly, not just in Israel, of the ancient Near East about kind of holiness and the like holy spaces. So this idea that they're trying to find kind of the cream of the crop of these young men that are versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. So they were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, Chaldeans here is probably a technical term meaning like diviners, like the people who were like astrologers, kind of. So they're supposed to learn all this special wisdom and knowledge and omen reading stuff, divination stuff from the Babylonians. And Daniel apparently says, fine, I'll learn that stuff. I mean, he doesn't seem to use it, right? What he uses is prayer as a way of connecting to God in these stories and getting divine knowledge. But he'll learn that. He'll learn the stupid stuff, right? Perhaps some of you are kind of gritting your teeth as we go through the Bible here with historical critical lenses, and you'll be like, well, okay, I'll learn that stuff, and I got to get credential, but then I'll get out of here, right? Well, that's what Daniel's doing here. Not historical critical things. He's learning about omens. But then verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of royal rations of food and wine. So we'll see that this is actually a problem. And then they were to be educated for 3 years so that at the end of the time they could be stationed in the king's court. So working for the king, learning the language and the literature, that means the culture and everything of these Chaldeans, and learning all their tricks and learning their jobs and whatever, that's fine. And working for the king there, that's fine. Spending 3 years being kind of fully immersed in their education system, fine. Sounds a little bit like seminary maybe. And then among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. The names that they receive are kind of like nonsense names. So Belshazzar is a name that makes some sense in Mesopotamian language, some Babylonian that kind of morphed into Hebrew. That makes some sense. But Belteshazzar, it's like they threw in a strange letter. Chungang Seao has suggested that these are like mocking names, kind of like calling someone, I don't know, like Richbird, instead of Richard. Like, I mean, it's trying to make them sound silly. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's at least one suggestion. But these young men seem to take these names and say, fine, okay, they don't seem to rebel against these names. So, okay, we'll take new names. We'll take the literature and language. We'll learn this stuff. We'll work for you. We'll learn your stupid astronomy stuff. But the food, right? This is where Daniel actually begins to draw lines. And in Esther, they didn't draw the line there. It's really interesting in other places, like in the book of Tobit, which is a book that's in some Christian Bibles, not others, that's written near the same time. There's this main character, Tobit. It's a great book. There's about a fish and a dog, and anyway, you'd like it if you read it, I'm sure. But anyway, there's issues about food and taking the food from Gentiles, eating food with Gentiles from Gentile markets and from Gentile tables. So this is in some Christian, some Jewish, not Christian yet, some Jewish communities at this time, this kind of table fellowship with Gentiles, but also the kind of taking food that might have been sacrificed to idols, or that doesn't follow the ritual laws, purity laws of the Old Testament, of especially Moses' laws. This can set off some alarms for some folks, but not for all. Esther, again, in her community, doesn't seem to be worried about this stuff at all. So there are different lines being drawn in different places at different times by different communities. All to say, for us, this seems to be kind of an open question, right? In today's cultures, where do people draw lines and where do they not? There isn't one God-ordained set of lines drawn. A lot of it has to do with outcomes, right? Like what do you want your community to look like? Well, that maybe we should draw the lines there. Where do things in this culture, whatever culture you're in, where do they conflict with some of your own deep values? So for Daniel, we're not exactly sure why the food is a big deal for him. He doesn't actually explain it, but that's where he draws the line, right? It's about kind of performing and creating one's identity. And this is actually really important for maintaining identity in a foreign culture or in a dominant culture in which one was a minority. To maintain some of these differences and is really crucial. So Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow himself not to defile himself. That's like a ritual word, don't defiling. This is probably something to do with ritual, like kind of food sacrifice to idols that would be incorporated in the royal retinue or something like that. That's probably at work here. Now, God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. Now, see how God's at work. It's very far away. God kind of like allows these things to happen to Daniel a certain way. God lets these things happen a certain way. But this is part of the story too, is that Daniel's faith in God doesn't like bring thunderbolts in the sky that blow up the Babylonians and send the Jews home. Instead, it's these little things that Daniel can see God's work through. The palace master then says to Daniel, "I'm afraid of the Lord, my lord the king." So the palace master says, "I have a job to keep you looking healthy. If you don't eat this good food, you probably won't look healthy, and I'm going to lose my job. The king has appointed your food and drink. If he should see you in poor condition than younger men of your own age, that would endanger my head with the king." So this guy's like, I could really suffer for this, right? So notice he doesn't say no. The palace master doesn't say no. He just says, you can't look different than the other guys. Wink. Then Daniel, in verse 11, does not go back to the palace master. Daniel goes to the guard, his local guard. Like the palace master is the guy overseeing the whole thing. He just says, I just don't want to know. Daniel goes to the guard, like on his hall or whatever, and says, okay, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance to the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and then deal with your servants according to what you observe. This, by the way, is the world's first ever known control study. Not kidding. This is the first ever scientific study where there's a control group, people who eat the normal food, and then there's this test group who eats different food. So you can see and you can compare after 10 days. I'm not kidding. That's actually in the history of science. This is an amazing thing. So he agreed to the proposal and tested them for 10 days. Now, what's in it for the guard? So the palace master just says, I just don't want to know. Don't look different. The guard is in it because we actually learn later that the guard, verse 16, continued to withdraw their royal rations. That's good food, worth money, and wine. This palace guard is taking their food, right? He's risking his own head too, but he's risking his own head because he's making money on it, right? So Daniel is worked out a deal. You take away our food and you keep it, whatever, and you give us just some lentils or something, some pulse crops or something like that, whatever, some not, vegetables. That word vegetables doesn't really mean vegetables. It probably means lentils, chickpeas. So then, the guard takes away the food, keeps it, and gives them these pulse crops, these lentils, and then to the 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every literature and wisdom, and Daniel had insight into visions and dreams. So they seem to prosper and thrive and in these circumstances, and even kind of grow in wisdom and knowledge. And then the king, there's this really strange thing that happens at the end of every chapter, which is that the kings find out who these guys are and learn about them and then promote them every single chapter as if they don't know who these guys are, which suggests to us that maybe these are lots of different individual stories that circulate about a guy named Daniel or these 3 youth, or maybe people with other names, or anonymous stories of people who succeeded and thrived in the midst of the diaspora that were then collected together into this kind of loose collection of stories. So in any event, that's Daniel 1, right? And by the way, this image that I've got up here is from a Mormon, a children's Bible. Now, you might know about Mormons, you might not know about Mormons, but the Church of the Latter-day Saints is really into a really important aspect of their piety is to not imbibe wine, alcohol of any kind, coffee, caffeine, and so you can see this kind of Utah-like youth, right? Somebody straight from Salt Lake City saying, no thanks, I don't want the wine. So you can see that you can imagine Daniel 1 has been really important for people who do draw lines based on food or drink and things that they think might defile themselves. Nation of Islam loves talking about Daniel chapter 1 when it talks about food and food choices. Just to name two very different communities, but throughout the history of Christianity, this has been really important for helping people draw, maintain, distinguish themselves based on food. We all know that food is really important and powerful too in terms of keeping identity, maintaining identity in things like diaspora too. So it's a natural thing as well. So I'm gonna skip chapter 2. Again, we'll get back to chapter 2 when we talk about the apocalyptic stuff in 7 through 12. But just to say, here's another story. Now notice that Daniel and his friends in chapter 3 verse 1, Daniel's gone. Like, where is Daniel? I don't even know. But here his three friends. By the way, this is a catacomb image. This is early Christian art. These are the three friends. They're dressed up like what people in the early Roman during the early Christianity thought that Persians looked like. So in any event, they're kind of set in the east according to what they thought people in the east looked like. But anyway, so chapter 3, verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this super tall, really thin, actually, image, which would fall over. What is the image? We're not told. It kind of doesn't matter. You got to bow down and worship this thing, and it's not Yahweh. That's all that matters. Is it a statue of himself? We don't know. It doesn't actually say. King Nebuchadnezzar sent for all the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. Notice this giant list which names everyone, right? So this totality, like the idea that like everyone is in this thing. Everyone's going to be named. Everyone's going to be brought in. This was part of the Persian Empire. They loved to amass all the peoples of, like representatives of the peoples of all of the places that they'd conquered and like make a fake army out of them and parade them around. Herodotus tells us about how they did this. They made a fake navy with like little people from, little groups of people from all of the different places that they conquered, and they would make them even like do a kind of Olympic-like rowing feats, and like the Phoenicians would always win. Herodotus says, you can imagine some Jews like rowing boats, being like, "What are we doing out here?" But this this image that you can see here in chapter 3 is kind of poking fun at that Persian political idea that they were dominating the entire world all at once, and that they were dominating all of the peoples of the world, kind of in like miniature almost. Like the whole world was represented by the peoples that they had conquered, and they would bring people to, say, Persia, to their capitals, one being Persepolis, and they would march them into this thing called the Gate of All Nations, and they had images of people from all over the world in this city. They were really proud of having dominated all the places of the earth. So here in this story, representatives of all the people of the earth have to come and worship the god, either Nebuchadnezzar himself or the god of Nebuchadnezzar, whatever. It doesn't matter. They're worshiping the empire. Everyone has to show up and worship the empire, and there's one group that subtracts itself. And notice that the Jews don't fight a war. They're not like firebombing the statue. They're not like even like carrying signs and protesting. They're just not there. They just don't show up. It's a protest by, it's a kind of a protesting by not showing up and not making a big deal of it. So this is kind of enrages the Persian king, because even this one person who just decides not to show up, it shows that they don't have all the power that they say they have. So a big theme in the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6 especially, is about power, about sovereignty. In fact, the real technical term in Hebrew for sovereignty shows up a whole lot in the book of Daniel, in both Hebrew and in Aramaic. This it's a big question for people who are in diaspora, right? Who's really sovereign? Who really has the power? Does the king of this majority empire have all the power? Or is God actually in control? And if God is, then why can't I see this power? Where is it? And so this idea of a hidden power, that God is behind kind of long-term transformations of empires, and that God has purposes which we can't really know and won't ever maybe even really know. This is a powerful theology that finds its first real expression here in this post-exilic literature like Esther and in Daniel. So I won't continue to read the story, but chapter 3 is again not exactly what we think it is. It's not the youth aren't asking to be executed, But just know that it's other Chaldeans who come, and like other magician kind of sorcerer guys who end up recognizing that the Jews aren't there, and they come and say, hey, king, these guys didn't show up for work today. There are certain Jews who, and it's because of their law. It's because of their strange law, right? So the things that stick out about us, whoever we are, right, that we want to protect, sometimes those things actually seem like weaknesses. Sometimes those things that seem to stick out for us, that make us seem different, are actually, or make us seem vulnerable even, because we're trying to hold on to them as a part of our identity that we don't want to let go of, but that also conflict with the values or the cultural markers of people around us. I think Daniel 3 is trying to tell us that those very things sometimes might be your source of strength, even when you don't expect it. So this law that says that they can't worship other gods, it seems to be this kind of Achilles heel for them. It's a weakness for them that other counselors can use to try to hurt them, if that makes sense. So in any event, this verse 12 of chapter 3, there are certain Jews, this is the counselors, the other counselors who are trying to get them. There are certain Jews whom you've appointed from the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods. They don't worship the golden statue you set up. And in chapter 6, the law is actually used, that word, the law, as a kind of weakness for them. So Nebuchadnezzar gets mad, he gets furious. You can notice in this literature that the kings oftentimes get really, really mad, and they like fly off the handle. I think this is making fun of them, because if you have actual total control, you don't have to get mad. Getting mad and getting like really furious even in public, letting go of your face. The king's face is really important for Daniel. When the kings like lose control of their face, it's a sign for you that like you actually aren't in control. Think of like a parent who gets furious at a kid and starts yelling at it. It means that the kid has the power to do things that the parent doesn't want to do, and the parent can't stop him, except just to yell at them. So all to say, it's a really fascinating observations about power and how power works in these stories. So then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get hauled up before the king. The king says, don't you want to worship my gods? Worship the statue. And if you don't worship, you'll be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And then I love the end of this in verse 15. Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? There's some great irony here, because it's Yahweh. But he doesn't know that yet, right? What God can deliver you out of the hands of the empire? I mean, what a ridiculous thought, right? Well, then, of course, verse 16, they don't defend themselves, which is really kind of fascinating to me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense for you in this matter. They're not attacking the king, attacking the god, attacking the statue. We don't need to defend ourselves. It's again not martyrdom exactly. Verse 17, if our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, we still won't serve you. So it's not putting God to the test exactly. It's again a fascinating depiction here of what Jews in diaspora thought their responsibility was to themselves and to God, but also they weren't going to put God to the test. They weren't going to demand that God, follow what they think that God should do. So again, in a way, it's about the limits of power and about the limits of our own abilities to control God. So then, of course, they survive with this other person in the fiery furnace, an angel of God. Christians will obviously say this is Jesus, but I just want to note that it doesn't say it's Jesus. I mean, God's angels do all sorts of things. But verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." So this is the kind of witness, right? Nebuchadnezzar gets it, and he goes back on this word in chapter 4, but still to say, like, this is an important moment. And then Nebuchadnezzar makes a decree in verse 29. I decree that any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses shall be laid in ruins, and so on. There's no other God that can deliver in this way. But it's interesting that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not need to defend God. They said, in fact, it's not our job to defend God. At the end of Daniel 3, the king thinks it's his job to defend God, and by threats of violence. Chapter 4 shows that he didn't get it. That's not good, right? That's not being lifted up as the right approach of a king. And I won't get into chapter 4, but it's about this transformation of Nebuchadnezzar. And chapters 5, the writing on the wall. Chapter 6, the lion's den episode. All of them play on these same themes in slightly different ways. But there's also a big theme that goes throughout about knowledge, and the connection between knowledge and power, and that kind of true knowledge. The Babylonians know a lot of things, but they actually don't know a lot of things too. And what Daniel knows is that when he prays, God shows him things he needs to know. Not everything, not random things, but things that are useful at the moment. And he gains the wisdom to be able to interpret these difficult situations that often put him in binds. So it's a reminder to Jews in diaspora about what they're supposed to do when they run up against a wall, right? Or when they run into a tight spot, or they run into a colleague who is trying to use their identity and their law, right? Their religious observance, their differences as a way of getting them. In chapter 6, that's a big deal, right? Daniel's prayer is a way of kind of like capturing him, just like worship in chapter 3 was a way of trying to capture these Jews and make them vulnerable. So you can see how this works with Esther as well. It's a broader concern about identity and power and knowledge and wisdom and God's presence and absence in God's work, all in the midst of one's attempt to maintain identity in the midst of an empire that's trying to steal it from you. There's obviously a lot of themes to work with today, right? So this literature is, I think, like immensely useful for the church at the moment, and I commend you to read it and take it seriously. We're gonna so pay attention to the form that's beneath here, where I'll ask you to think about ways that you might see your own ministry or potentials for these texts to intersect with actual events in the world and situations and contexts in the world around us. And we'll come back next time. We'll talk about the rest of Daniel chapter 7 through 12 and that apocalyptic literature. Whew, let's get apocalyptic. The end of the semester, the end of the world. Maybe it's a bit close to home this time through the course. But in any event,